This is Bob Dwyer with the Carbon Monoxide Safety Association. This looks like a long title for this presentation, though it's going to be simply a demonstration of carbon dioxide measurement in several settings. This is where the title comes in: carbon dioxide, or CO2, in the house, in the car, in outside air, or under the face mask. A few discussions ago, I presented a brief video on measuring CO2 levels starting outside and then moving inside my house and then into a small guest toilet and bathroom that could be easily sealed to restrict circulating air from getting in or out without wrapping it in vinyl. For now, let's start with air. Air is a good starting point. What do we know about air? All air chemical composition charts list nitrogen as the predominant measured gas at around 78%. Oxygen is usually referenced at 20.9%, and argon just under 1% at 0.93%. Carbon dioxide heads the list of trace gases at just over 0.04%. Water vapor, or just vapor, is 1 to 5% and does not always make the air chemical composition charts, generally referenced in 1 to 3%. But CO2 occurs naturally in our Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is odorless. Obviously, outdoors can have many odors, but science and testing has quantified and updates what is in the air we breathe. You can do some of this measurement as well, as you'll see. This brief slide video presentation might give you some ideas how you can incorporate CO2 testing into your service profession or in the assistance to manage the air you breathe. Have you ever been in a classroom or in a meeting and you were just so uncomfortable you hardly cared what the discussion was? It feels stuffy, a little bit warm. Some are getting slight headaches or worse. Some are feeling a little agitated or sleepy. Some are just dazing out into that vast vision of white noise thoughts. But hang in there. These are the best times of your lives, learning new stuff. Carbon dioxide. Let's measure it. Fire, fire everywhere. If you have viewed any of my other slide presentations, I know you've seen this slide, used in reference to carbon monoxide and combustion gas source examples. The thing about measurement is that it's never ending. Measurement of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide is dynamic in that they both have desirable in-air concentrations, but those can deviate and be unhealthy in a very brief period of time. Knowing about sources of combustion is vital to healthier and safer systems, buildings, and people. So people live in spaces. We need to know some of the building characteristics, like how tight it is with air exchanges in the conditioned space. One way of determining air exchange is measurement using a blower door. Too tight causes problems. Make-up air is mandatory for aerobic organisms to breathe and combustion appliances to use. Too many people in a room or building with inadequate ventilation can result in serious health and safety concerns. We need to know the building tightness, the occupancy, ventilation, and health effects felt and observed by people in those spaces. This information greatly increases our understanding of remedial and avoiding strategies to perform our duties diligently to aid those who may be affected. So what about carbon dioxide, or CO2? How much is too much? Can too high of a concentration make me tired or even unhealthy? Yes, it can. I very seldom encounter anyone who measures CO2 regularly enough to talk about it with more than some rote recollection of text. When I do, it's great. Well, starting with these three news stories, and this first one here, that were posted on the cosafety.blogspot.com site this week, we can enter into this world of CO2 measurement. This first story: driver in crash may have passed out from wearing N95 mask too long. The driver of a single-car crash in Lincoln Park, New Jersey is believed to have passed out behind the wheel, according to the police, reported in WSB Atlanta. Well, in reference from Vanguard, warning: prolonged use of face mask produces hypoxia. Breathing over and over exhaled air turns into carbon dioxide, which is why we feel dizzy. This intoxicates the user and much more. Well, there's a story. Here's another one from The Guardian. Happy hypoxia. Unusual coronavirus effect baffles doctors. The quote, "It's intriguing to see so many people coming in. Quite how hypoxic they are," said a doctor and a consultant in critical care and anesthesia. "We're seeing oxygen saturations that are very low, and they're unaware of that." Well, and as if to assist with our understanding of what's going on, from Stanford Children's Health, last week posted at cosafety.blogspot.com, Anatomy of the Respiratory System. Let's take a look at that. The lungs take in oxygen. The cells of your body's cells need oxygen to live and carry out their normal functions. The lungs also get rid of carbon dioxide, a waste product of the cells. Well, Stanford's Children's Health, thank you. Well, that helps us understand aerobic organisms, which is us. We can only live in the presence of oxygen. And we know the complex protein that contains iron, carries oxygen in our blood, is called hemoglobin. We inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. So we've already determined air is approximately 78% nitrogen, 20.9% oxygen, about 0.093% argon, and our trace gas of carbon dioxide is just over 0.04%. Well, this CO2 level is up from the pre-industrial concentrations of just under 0.03% at 0.028%. And CO2 occurs naturally in our atmosphere. Again, we've said sources being volcanoes, hot springs, Old Faithful type geysers. CO2 is also contained in deposits of oil and gas. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been measured for many years. The recent chart out of the Mauna Loa Observatory shows the CO2 levels over 410 parts per million. And if you take a look in the middle there where it says BD began measuring CO2, that's the time when I began measuring CO2, when I had my first handheld infrared carbon dioxide measuring device. So what I'm using right now is the TPI model SP1000, a carbon dioxide smart probe, at plus or minus 50 parts per million in accuracy. You can see I'm reading it outside there. I'm verifying the outdoor CO2 measurement. Now this is the program that I did a couple weeks ago. So we took that first measurement. Sophie and I had gone outside. We'd left the doors open to let the air from outside freshen up the inside. We left the cross-ventilating doors open, and we closed them, came in and took a measurement, and then I proceeded to go into the next room. The dynamics of this as I entered that room is one person enters the space within the conditioned space and closes the door. Now this is a small guest bathroom. It's about 200 cubic feet. My outside measurements were around 385 parts per million of CO2. I came inside to 646 parts per million of CO2. And I went into that small guest bathroom and had 646 parts per million of CO2. As I moved closer to that room, the CO2 levels dropped to 643 parts per million. So this is basically two rooms in the middle of the house. We walked into one, and I closed the door, and then I walked into the shower and toilet room and closed the door and put a towel down at the base of the door. There's no ventilation in that room now. And you can see just after 10 minutes what the levels are, 1,282 parts per million of CO2. Well, that's pretty significant. That's only 10 minutes, and that's one person, and I'm rebreathing my own breath. And this science experiment took time. I stood in there for 30 minutes. And in the end of 30 minutes, this one person was breathing in 2,176 parts per million of CO2. That's my breath. So very simply, we finished that experiment, and there's the conditions that we left. Everything else was pretty much the same, except for when I was in that confined space of 2,176 parts per million of CO2. Well, here's a little setup for my mini testing station. You can see my gas cans of carbon monoxide gas. And here's a 2-liter jar that was a beverage jar. It's got a spout on it. I've used it with testing before. It's got a sealed lid on the top. I also have a lid that has a hole in it. And in this particular case, I took one breath, took a breath of air, and I blew it into a balloon. So let's see how much CO2 we can measure in one expired breath into a small space into this jar. Well, we'll go ahead and put air into our jar. I've got air in the balloon. We've got our SP1000 set up. Now my screen on my phone may go dark every once in a while. I apologize for that. I'll try to keep it active for you. I'll try not to talk too much as we watch the expired breath go into the jar. Yes, carbon dioxide can cause suffocation if that's all you're breathing in. Carbon dioxide levels, when they increase, can make you feel drowsy. There's a lot of problems associated with carbon dioxide. You can see just from one expired breath how much carbon dioxide we may have, and that's just going into a container now. So let's take a closer look at CO2 levels. So we'll take a look at another airspace. We'll take a look at an outside measurement here, carbon dioxide. My wife and I are going to take a car trip to pick up groceries. So we've got 406 parts per million of CO2 measured when we start this trip. I walked in the house, my wife, myself, and our dog Sophie. We've got 1,000 parts per million of CO2 in the house this morning. I'm going to head to the garage. So I enter the passage door from the house into the garage. It's a 2-car garage. I'm just one person. I still have the exit door closed. I've got 785 parts per million of CO2 inside the vehicle that I'm waiting for my wife to get into. As my wife enters the garage, she opens up the big exit door. She gets into the car and closes it. And now there's 2 people in the car. We haven't started it yet, and we've got a measurement of 1,400 parts per million of CO2, and we started with 400 parts per million in outside air. It took us around 12 minutes to get to the grocery store, so we pulled into the space. We called for our groceries to come out and be delivered. And we had the ventilation control open the whole time that we drove over, and we still had over 1,500 parts per million of CO2 in the car when we pulled into the space and turned the car off. Now we had the windows closed. 17 minutes after arriving, that's 2 people, my wife and I, were waiting for our groceries. The windows are still closed, the car is not running, and we're at over 3,000 parts per million of CO2. So we waited 27 minutes for our groceries, which really wasn't too long considering the numbers of people, how hard the grocery stores are working to accommodate people that are not going into stores. So 27 minutes later, still, my wife and I inside our vehicle, the windows are still closed, the car's not running, we're at over 4,000 parts per million of CO2, and my wife and I are starting to yawn, and our groceries arrive. That was our little experimental trip of measurement of carbon dioxide to pick up groceries. We started at 406 parts per million of CO2, and we experienced 10 times that amount in less than 45 minutes. Here's another experiment with the SP1000 Smart Stick. We're starting with 726 parts per million of CO2 in the house. And just my dog and I are in the house today. And I take that Smart Stick, I put it in underneath my protective mask. And as I exhale carbon dioxide. You can see that it's being measured. Over 9,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So we have to be careful wearing our masks. We have to be careful not wearing our masks. It's a tough situation for us to be in right now. We need to pay attention. We need to ask our medical advisors, what do we know about this? What can we do? I don't know. These levels keep going up. They keep going up. We really need to pay attention to what's happening to us right now. Because I really don't know. I mean, look, we're at 22,000 parts per million. And it got up over 24,000 parts per million. You know, these are substantial measurements of carbon dioxide. And again, really, our health professionals, this would really be some good information to know the impact this is going to have on all of us. So to put it simply, we know air is breathed in, oxygen is pumped, stored, and carried through the respiratory, cardiovascular, and central nervous systems. Now, as you have seen, we are rebreathing carbon dioxide, encapsulating it, and impacting oxygen inhalation. Each of us should be aware that this is occurring and know it might be having impacts on us. So when we look at just these postings from this week, driver in crash may have passed out from wearing N95 mask too long. Warning, prolonged use of face masks produces hypoxia, or happy hypoxia. Unusual coronavirus effect baffles doctors. The more we test, the more we know. And I knew a long time ago if I didn't measure carbon dioxide in the spaces I was teaching in, people would get uncomfortable. If the ventilation system isn't handling the occupancy load, you have to incorporate a fresh air strategy. And I'd like to suggest a fresh air strategy. You simply let air exchange from outside to inside faster than you normally would when you're in a heating or cooling season. Obviously, you may have some restrictions doing this when conditions are restrictive, or uncomfortable, or too costly. There are ways to get fresh air into your homes and buildings without a dramatic energy penalty, but you have to measure it. You have to know if your attendees are uncomfortable, if the people in your assembly are uncomfortable, because if they're uncomfortable, they're not going to get what you're trying to teach them. I don't care who you are. Anybody can start feeling drowsy when levels increase to twice outside levels, and even more dramatically as the CO2 levels increase. Crowded, underventilated classrooms are unhealthy and offer resistances to learning. Crowded gathering halls and buildings are also subject to the laws of respiration. Fresh air is vital to learning and good health. When you're breathing in carbon dioxide above outside levels, if you're in the room, you're breathing in your own CO2, but you're also breathing in the CO2 of everybody else. Aerobic organisms need oxygen and preferably levels of CO2 close to outside levels. It is easy to get dizzy in crowded, underventilated spaces. There's a lot of breath being shared. That was carbon dioxide in the car, under the face mask, and in the air. These are moments of carbon dioxide measurement. I'm Bob Dwyer with the Carbon Monoxide Safety Association. Remember, the more people inside a building, the greater the buildup of carbon dioxide. There's much more we can discuss regarding CO2. If we don't measure it, we really don't know much about it, or its habits, or our habits for that matter. We'll keep on measuring. I hope you will too. Please visit cosafety.blogspot.com, the Carbon Monoxide News, and let's be safe.